Good day and welcome to Living Words, Scripture and Tradition, brought to you by your Catholic neighbors and friends of the Diocese of Biloxi. I'm Father Joe Dilettuso, your host. I hope you were with us last time because you know we are on the second of a six-part series concerning the passion narratives of the four Gospels. Very pleased and happy to have with us for these 6 sessions Father Austin Walsh. Many of us remember him from when he was pastor at Annunciation Parish in the Kill. Father Walsh is now up in Canton, Mississippi, where he is the pastor of Holy Child Jesus Parish. Austin, it's good to have you with us and looking forward to hearing about particularly the Passion narrative according to Mark this week.
Good afternoon. It's good to be back again. And this afternoon we will be discussing the Passion narrative according to the evangelist Mark. I'm starting with Mark because tradition says that it's the oldest account. And I think also, just to recap some of the things I said last week, that we have 4 accounts of the same historical event, the crucifixion and death of Jesus. But because they're not just writing mere history, but because they're writing an event that has theological and spiritual ramifications, we have 4 of them, because each community which formed these Gospels, and don't forget, the Gospels are the creation of a community, and not vice versa. And therefore, each of the evangelists, according to his individual perspective, his particular problems in the Christian community that was formed by him and continued by other people, will have an emphasis that the others do not. Because each of these is written independently of the other. In fact, there were people in Mark's community might never have known there was a Matthew's Gospel or a John's Gospel. In fact, it's not until much later that the church sees all 4 of these books as inspired by God. Mark's, of course, was probably used by the other 2 synoptics, Luke and Matthew. But be that as it may, Mark's Gospel is the most primitive. And in the account that we're going to read, you're going to see a very stark picture of the death of Jesus. Now, this is because Mark's community, or at the time the Gospel was written, had just undergone and was still undergoing the persecution by the Emperor Nero. And so he's writing it, or the author is writing this, for a community that has experienced the cost of discipleship, for a community that could be discouraged if it were not for the remembrance that Jesus himself had undergone this rejection and this persecution. And therefore Mark presents us with an account of the death and resurrection of Jesus that is very dismal and very stark. And we'll see as we read the text that Mark, more than any of the other evangelists, underlines the total abandonment of Jesus, especially by his disciples. The other evangelists sort of, mention that, but they don't overemphasize it. Mark doesn't leave any holes barred. He says the disciples abandoned Jesus. And so, if you want to know what it means to die alone, read this Gospel. Okay, and let's start with the text, which would be the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, and I'm using the New Jerusalem Bible translation for this. Okay, so we start with going into the garden after the Last Supper. They came to a plot of land called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Stay here while I pray." Then he took Peter and James and John with him, and he began to feel terror and anguish. And he said to them, "My soul is sorrowful to the point of death. Wait here and stay awake." And going on a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, this hour might pass him by. "Abba, Father," he said, "for you everything is possible. Take this cup away from me, but let it be as you, not I, would have it." He came back and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Had you not the strength to stay awake 1 hour? Stay awake and pray not to be put to the test. The spirit is willing enough, but human nature is weak." Again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came back and found them sleeping. Their eyes were so heavy, and they could find no answer for him. He came back a third time, and he said to them, "You can sleep on now and have your rest. It is all over. The hour has come. Now the Son of Man is to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us go. My betrayer is not far away." Here you have, very starkly put, Jesus coming to grips with the fact that he is going to die. And so you have the picture of total abandonment and total resignation. Even though in this account we have no answer from the Father, Jesus has received no answer at all, yet we are given to understand that Jesus knows that the Father wants him to drink of this cup for the sake of something. And so he is abandoned to the Father's will. He knows that the Father will indeed rescue him. This tremendous fear of death is something that really stirs me because it shows the human Jesus. Again, as Christians, we are holding on to something we don't fully understand and appreciate, and that is the humanity and the divinity of Jesus. However, I think we Christians, and maybe specifically we Catholic Christians, have emphasized his divinity so much that we forget the human Jesus. We forget that, as is said in Scripture, he was like us in all things except he did not sin. So when it comes to dying, Jesus is going to have the same human fear of death that you have and I have. And this, over the centuries, has caused problems for Christians and for non-believers alike. Christians, in order to show that Jesus was God, said, well, he couldn't be that afraid, because if he's God, then he knows how it all comes out. And therefore, the reason he was sorrowful was that passing before him were all the sins of humankind. And that's what made him sorrowful. Then you have the rationalistic explanation, which says this proves that he wasn't divine, because he shows the emotion that we all have as human beings, afraid of death. And he was even not as brave as, say, Socrates was when he took the poison to pass on to a better world, to pass on from this world of shadows into the world of light. So you have those two extremes, the overly pious interpretation and the rationalistic interpretation. What we have to see is this: Jesus is human. If we say he's like us in all things except sin, then he does fear death, like you fear death and I fear death. And even though our faith now tells us that because of his death and resurrection, death has been conquered, death is still the enemy. I mean, even though we know death is not the end, because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, because of our belief that we shall also be raised from the dead, doesn't make dying easier. It's still the enemy, because it causes so much pain and sorrow to people. We have to leave loved ones behind. They have to let us go, and they're saddened by it. So how can we ever say that death is a good thing? It's not a good thing. It's an evil thing. But what Jesus has done by his death and resurrection was to rob it of its absolute power, so that death no longer destroys us, but it's still a difficult thing to pass through. So it doesn't disprove the divinity of Jesus because he was afraid of death, and it doesn't prove the fact that he knew everything and he had a foreknowledge by the fact that he saw all these sins passing before him. I think that's a pious notion that we can no longer hold. that Jesus is human. And maybe we have to say it here without much preparation and maybe with a little bit of reaction. I hope not. But the fact is that Jesus was always God from the moment of his conception on, I mean, his pre-existence. But in his humanity, he always bore within himself the divinity. But I think in order to try as best we can to balance the divinity-humanity thing, many scripture scholars would tell us that Jesus becomes aware of his divinity at resurrection, so that he's not walking around knowing everything that's going to happen tomorrow, because if he can do that, then he's not like me and he's not like you. So that Jesus loved and laughed, Jesus needed friends, he experienced loneliness, any human emotion that you have and I have, Jesus had, or else I can't identify with him. And in the church year, we read that whole book, the letter to the Hebrews, and that very beautifully shows the humanity and the divinity of Jesus. So anyway, this whole Gethsemane scene, to me, points out the true humanity of Jesus, and that he has faith. He gets up from prayer without any consolation, but knowing that this is the Father's will. And so often as disciples, we are called upon after prayer to do the will of God, even though we don't feel good about it. You know, I think that this is a good place to make a distinction between happiness and Christian joy. They're not the same thing. When you accept Jesus, it doesn't mean you're never going to have a sad day in your life. Or if you accept Jesus, it doesn't mean you get up some days figuring, I'd rather stay in bed. And it's not walking around with this silly grin on your face all the time, that I found Jesus. Happiness to me is a matter of the glands. Joy is a gift of the Spirit. And no matter what's happening to me, you know, the world might be falling in over my head, but if I have the gift of Christian joy, I know that it has meaning somewhere. But I'm not going to laugh about it. I'm going to cry about it. So I think to follow Jesus sometimes means that we're not going to always be consoled and we're not always going to feel good. And that's what makes some people get turned off about Christianity, is that they're told they always have to feel good, and once you accept Jesus, that's it. That's just the beginning. And he will gift us with joy, but that doesn't mean we're going to be knee-slapping, laughing, back-slapping people the rest of our lives. You know, that I don't think is one of the gifts of the Spirit. Okay, let's continue in the reading so that Jesus comes back, and we're going to see that Mark likes groups of threes. He went away and prayed 3 times. He came back 3 times, and he told them to stay awake. Okay, the arrest. And at once, while he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up, and with him a number of men armed with swords and clubs, sent by the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the traitor had arranged a signal with them, saying, "The one I kiss, he is the man. Arrest him, and see he is well guarded when you lead him away." So when the traitor came, he went up to Jesus at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The other seized him and arrested him. Then one of the bystanders drew his sword and struck out at the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. Then Jesus spoke. "Am I a bandit," he said, "that you had to set out to capture me with swords and clubs? I was among you teaching in the temple day after day, and you never laid a hand on me. But this is to fulfill the scriptures." And they all deserted him and ran away. A young man followed with nothing on but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the cloth in their hands and ran away naked. Again, this total abandonment of Jesus. It said, and they all deserted him and ran away. Again, it's one thing to have to face death, and of course, the cruel death of crucifixion. You know, and because we have so many beautiful artistic pictures of crucifixes and crosses inlaid with mother of pearl and gold, that we see it as an art object, and we fail to see it as a cruel vehicle of execution. And it's time that we Christians got the crucifixes and the crosses off the walls and bore them in our bodies, as St. Paul told us we're supposed to. But so this notion of facing what the Romans considered a barbarian's death, crucifixion, was bad enough. And when we die, no matter what way we die, we don't know, that's going to be difficult enough. But to die alone, or to die abandoned, is horrible. And so Mark wants to underscore that. And they all deserted him. To the point where he uses that young man with a linen, that they were so anxious to get away from Jesus that he left his clothes and ran away naked, which shows, according to Mark, total abandonment. Just as the disciples had left everything to follow him, now they're leaving everything to run away from him. And Mark very beautifully points that out with the story of the young man in the linen cloth. Who that young man is, nobody knows. But it does show and does underscore for us the total abandonment that Jesus had to suffer. Now, as I mentioned, it is a difficult passage, but we have to keep in mind now that Jesus, because of the resurrection now, we say God and man. But in this historical situation, we're dealing with a man of faith. A man who spoke the truth and lived the truth, and now he is about ready to take the consequences for the truth. You know, that's where true discipleship of Jesus is marked off from sunshine Christians. You know, when we said we were going to be disciples of Jesus, we are supposed to have left everything behind. I mean, to be a disciple means there's certain cords we got to break. There are certain lifestyles and ways of living and acting that we can no longer engage in if we say we're disciples of Jesus. And that's the dying I was speaking about last week. But what has happened in Christianity, because it's become kind of a cultural thing in many countries, and we even say that America is a Christian country, although I think that's something we should watch, because America is also a country for all people, not just Christians. Yet the Christian principles are supposed to have been those things which directed us and led us in the forming of our Constitution and so on. But what happens is that we pick and choose how we're going to be disciples of Jesus, you know. So when it comes down to saying put up or shut up, I shut up. Fish or cut bait, I cut bait. Because the discipleship sometimes asks me to do difficult things. And what these disciples don't want to do is be associated with Jesus, because if there's going to be any killing going on, they don't want to be part of it. And they don't even want to be associated with Jesus or seen with him, because they'll be guilty by association. They followed him when he worked his miracles, and they followed him when he did great things, and they had these expectations that they would share in his human glory when he took over the kingdom. Now that everything he told them about is not that this is new to them, about suffering and dying and leaving behind, now they don't want to do it. And I think in our Lenten meditations on the Passion of Jesus, I think we're going to have to ask, how much does it cost me to be a disciple? You know, Jesus said to us, you know, don't worry about the world hating you because it has hated me before you. My brothers and sisters, I think the real judgment against us Christians of the latter part of the 20th century is that the world doesn't hate us at all, because maybe the world doesn't see any difference in us. We're just as materialistic. In fact, some religious groups even associate prosperity with God's will. We're just as consumeristic, militaristic, sexist, you name it, we can be found in either camp. In fact, when Christians come along and start really authentically preaching discipleship, like pacifism, not giving in to systems, we sort of put them to the side and even persecute them. We like prophets, but we like them dead. We don't like live prophets because they're a pain in the neck, because they keep reminding us that we made promises and maybe we're not keeping those promises. And so at baptism, we begin our discipleship. We begin it. And it's a lifelong process. And maybe at times we're not always successful, but at least we don't canonize our non-discipleship way of acting. If we don't act like disciples, at least we'll know it. But what happens is that we have watered down the gospel so that any kind of action can be blessed by God. And so racism and militarism, Christians can be racist, they think. We can separate ourselves from other people and worship God differently because we think we're superior. And I just don't see how we can think that way having read the scriptures. But we can rationalize anything. We can take scripture, we can use it for our own purposes and ends. Okay, so the next scene in Mark's gospel is Jesus before the Sanhedrin. And here you're going to see two trials going on. The trial in the Sanhedrin and the trial that Peter is going through in the courtyard. And it's interesting to contrast the two men on trial, Jesus and Peter. They led Jesus off to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and the scribes assembled there. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the high priest's palace, and he was sitting with the attendants warming himself at the fire. So here you have Peter, who didn't totally abandon Jesus. He's still worried about his friend. He's following at a distance just to see what happens to Jesus. And therefore he sits in the courtyard and waits, either to bring the news to his compatriots or just out of human compassion himself. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus in order to have him executed, but they could not find any. Several indeed brought false witness against him, but their evidence was conflicting. Some stood up and submitted this false evidence against him. We heard him say, "I am going to destroy this temple made by human hands, and in 3 days build another, not made by human hands." Now, I have a problem with that, and I haven't been able to resolve it. That's not false evidence. Jesus did say that. So what Mark means by that, I don't know, how this could be conflicting evidence. Jesus did say, you destroy this temple, in 3 days I will raise it up again. So maybe, I think most scripture scholars says we're missing something here. I mean, there's been a whole, maybe paragraph lost. So it's conflicting, but it really isn't conflicting. Okay, but even at this point, the evidence was conflicting. The high priest then rose before the whole assembly and put this question to Jesus. Have you no answer to that? What is this evidence these men are bringing against you? But he was silent and made no answer at all. The high priest put a second question to him, saying, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his robes and said, "What need have we of witness? You heard the blasphemy. What is your finding?" The verdict was unanimous. He deserved to die. Some of them started spitting at his face, hitting him and saying, "Play the prophet." And the attendants struck him too. Again, abandonment. Jesus doesn't get a fair trial. They are so anxious to have him done away with because he is disrupting the people that they are willing just to go through the trial real quickly, and the high priest forces the others to a unanimous verdict. But there's not one person who stands up and says, let's wait because this could be an innocent man. Nobody. And to add insult to injury, an unjust judgment is passed. They spit on him and they ask him to prophesy after slapping his face. And so his claim that he is a prophet is made fun of. You'll see this again in Mark's gospel. They're interested in his claim to be a prophet, and when he's on the cross, they will again make fun of him and tell him to play the prophet. When he goes to the Roman trial, which is the next scene, they ask him, after they scourge him and beat him, they hail him as king, because Caesar would not be interested in some Jewish rabbi claiming to be the Messiah, but he would be interested in someone coming into his kingdom and saying they're a king. So on one hand, you're going to have the religious trial of Jesus, and on the other hand, the political trial of Jesus. And both are unjust trials. And both will show the total abandonment of Jesus, not only by his co-religionists, but by his disciples, and of course he didn't expect it from the Roman emperor. But anyway, Jesus now is condemned to die. And it's only in St. John's Gospel why it is explained that after he's condemned to die by the Sanhedrin, he has to be sent over to Pilate, because the Jewish people had the right to condemn people to death for crimes, but they could not execute the sentence. That had to be the Roman law and not the Jewish law. So you see, the scene is moving, and next week we're going to talk more and more about this and try to sum up Mark's theology of discipleship that is inherent in how he accounts the death of Jesus. So we saw the Gethsemane scene, total, absolute abandonment, and seeming abandonment by God. But he gets up from the prayer with the Father resolute. I will do the Father's will. I will drink of this cup. During Lent, you and I are asked to ask, what are we asked to do as disciples? What am I asked to die to? What am I asked to let go of? What am I asked to, like the man running out of the garden naked, throw off so that I could be naked before my Lord, so that I could be a disciple? Good afternoon, and please join us again next week. God bless you.
Your comments and suggestions concerning this program or topics for future programs would be greatly appreciated. Mail your comments to Living Words, Post Office Box 1189, Biloxi, Mississippi 39533.